The origin of the Assassins lies deep in the complex religious landscape of medieval Islam and is inseparably connected with the Shiite faith. Within Islam, different currents had developed early after the death of the Prophet Muhammad, with the division between Sunnis and Shiites being the most profound and, to this day, the most effective. The Shiites, who based the rightful claim to leadership on Muhammad's son-in-law Ali and his descendants, developed over the centuries various subgroups, of which one of the most influential were the Ismailis. Within this Ismaili direction, in turn, that movement finally formed, which later entered history as the Assassins. The Ismailis distinguished themselves from other Shiite groups above all in their conception of the doctrine of the imamat, that is, the religious and political leadership of the community. They believed in an unbroken line of divinely appointed imams who possessed both spiritual and worldly authority. Unlike the Twelver Shiites, who assumed after the 12th imam an age of hidden leadership, the Ismailis recognized another genealogical line, which led them into the 11th century, initially in the form of the Fatimids in Egypt, who even established their own caliphate. This notion of a living imam who was divinely inspired and could exclusively interpret the truth gave the Ismaili doctrine a particularly hierarchical and esoteric character. The Ismailis were considered already early on as intellectually demanding and philosophically shaped. Their religious concepts were often mystical, allegorical, and strongly directed toward inner knowledge. This unorthodox approach to the Quran and the Sharia led to them being regarded not only by the Sunni majorities, but also by other Shiites often as heretical. Their theology stood in clear contrast to the legally oriented and more formalized Sunni Islam. In a religious climate that was strongly marked by political power struggles, this was a dangerous special path. Out of this field of tension gradually arose that movement which later in the West became known under the name Assassins. It thus did not originate from a foreign or external religion, but developed within Shiite Islam, more precisely from a minority group within the Ismailis. These origins explain why the Assassins from the very beginning had a strongly developed identity as a persecuted, encircled, and at the same time highly educated community. Their later strategy, not to operate through military superiority, but through targeted symbolic violence against high-ranking opponents, can also be understood from this ideological special position. In a world in which power politics, theology, and loyalty were often inseparably interwoven, religious deviation meant at the same time political threat. The Ismailis therefore had to preserve not only their doctrine, but also defend themselves against permanent external pressure. The emergence of the later Assassins was therefore not a pure movement of faith, but a consequence of the necessity to secure a threatened religious identity in a hostile environment. In the history of Islam, they were thus unique, neither a mere sect nor a political faction, but an ideologically closed, intellectually demanding, and militarily strategically sophisticated community whose origin is deeply rooted in the inner Islamic struggle for truth, power, and legitimacy. Division of the Ismailis. The division of the Ismaili movement in the year was a key moment in the history of the Assassins and marked the beginning of their independent existence. It did not arise from theological or doctrinal disagreement, but from a bitter dispute over political succession within the Fatimid Caliphate in Egypt, one of the most powerful and culturally influential Islamic empires of that time. This conflict over the succession to the throne resulted in a deep division of the Ismaili community, from which finally emerged the more radical and split-off Nizari direction. That branch, which later, through its assassinations, would become world-famous under the name of the Assassins. At the center of this dispute stood the question of who should take the rightful succession of the Fatimid Caliph al-Mustanir Billah. Al-Mustanir ruled the Fatimid realm, a Shiite caliphate with its center in Cairo, for several decades, and was recognized in the Ismaili world as a living imam. Toward the end of his long reign, however, within his family, a power struggle broke out between his two sons, the elder Nizar and the younger Ahmad, who later became known under the name al-Mustali. Although Nizar, as the firstborn son, and thus from the Ismaili perspective as the legitimate successor, was regarded as such, after the death of the caliph it was not he, but al-Mustali, who through influential circles at the court, above all through the powerful vizier al-Afdal, was proclaimed as the new caliph and imam. This was a clear break with the traditional doctrine of the imamate, according to which the imam is not simply politically appointed, but passed on through divine designation in genealogical line. For many Ismailis, especially those in Persia, this was an intolerable betrayal of the divine order. Nizar, who in Alexandria proclaimed himself counter-caliph, was militarily defeated, captured, and finally killed. With his death, the dynastic line at first seemed interrupted, but many of his followers believed that one of his sons had been secretly rescued and that the imamate continued, hidden but existent. This conviction became the foundation of a new Ismaili movement, which from then on called itself Nizari and claimed to represent the true line of the imams. This Nizari direction distanced itself not only from the Fatimid court in Cairo, but also organizationally and geographically from the rest of the Ismaili world. Especially in Persia, where the Nizaris had already built strong networks, the split developed into a complete separation. It was in this context that Hassan-i Sabbah, a charismatic scholar and missionary, took over the leadership of the movement and shaped it out of persecution into a new independent organization. The split of 1090 was more than just a dynastic power struggle. It was a turning point which transformed a religious minority into a highly organized, ideologically consolidated, and strategically acting movement. The Nizari Ismailis henceforth defined themselves not only by their theology, but by resistance, secrecy, and independence. At a time in which power was mostly secured through military or inheritance, they chose a third, unconventional form, through underground organization, targeted political intervention, and soon also through the construction of their own power center, which could oppose official power not territorially, but intellectually and symbolically. Out of this split ultimately emerged the community which in history became known as the Assassins. Foundation by Hassan-i Sabbah. The foundation of the movement by Hassan-i Sabbah around the turn of the millennium was the decisive moment in which from the religious direction of the Nizaris, a concrete, historically tangible organization emerged. Hassan-i Sabbah was not only a religious leader, but also a brilliant strategist, theorist, and organizer who understood how to form from a small persecuted group a disciplined, fearless, and effectively operating community. With the takeover of the fortress of Alamut in the Elburz Mountains in northern Iran, he created the institutional and geographical core of what in the West would later be called the Order of Assassins. Hassan-i Sabbah himself was originally part of the Ismaili missionary movement and had enjoyed a classical education in theology, logic, and the sciences. Little is known with certainty about his early life, yet much speaks in favor of the fact that he distinguished himself through extraordinary intelligence, ascetic way of life, and unshakable faith in the mission of the Ismailis. After he had sided with the elder prince Nizar, who in the succession dispute over the Fatimid Caliphate in Cairo was defeated, Hassan became the most important leader of that group, which, in the split of the Nizaris, saw themselves as the true bearers of the divine imamate. The takeover of Alamut was a stroke of genius. The fortress lay strategically perfect, high up in the mountains with a view over a fertile valley, difficult to access and easy to defend. According to reports, it was not conquered by Hassan with violence, but taken through a mixture of persuasion and deception. He apparently had deliberately infiltrated followers into the garrison, who gradually gained influence until the then commander was forced or persuaded to withdraw. With the capture of Alamut, Hassan created not only a safe refuge, but a spiritual and military center of the Nizari movement, a stronghold of independence that for decades would withstand the encirclement by more powerful enemies. Under Hassan-i Sabbah, Alamut was not only expanded as a fortress, but above all as a place of learning, discipline, and organization. Here developed a network of missionaries, students, and fighters who followed a strict internal code and whose loyalty to Hassan and to the idea of the hidden imam was unshakable. Education, obedience, and conviction became the cornerstones of this community. And unlike many contemporary military or religious groups, Hassan did not strive for territorial conquests, but for the safeguarding of the community through intelligent tactics, religious cohesion, and strategic interventions, for example, through the targeted elimination of enemy leaders. The foundation of Alamut as the center of the Nizari movement was also a clear declaration of war against the established order, both against the Sunni Seljuks, who controlled large parts of Persia, and against the Fatimid Ismailis in Egypt, who had joined the Mustali line. In a time in which religious deviation was quickly equated with heresy and treason, this step meant open resistance. But Hassan was ready to pay this price. He did not see himself as a rebel, but as the preserver of the true line of the Imam, and was convinced that the divine order stood on his side. In the following years, from this small, secluded community in Alamut, there would develop a far-reaching organization which operated with great discipline, clever propaganda, and extraordinary determination. Yet, everything began with Hassan-i Sabbah, whose vision, courage, and strategic thinking formed from a theologically isolated current, a movement that left deep traces in the history of Islam not only militarily, but also ideologically and symbolically. The takeover of Alamut was the first act of this unprecedented transformation. Alamut becomes the center. After Hassan-i Sabbah had brought the fortress of Alamut under his control around 1090, this place rapidly became the strategic, spiritual, and symbolic center of the Nizari movement. Alamut was far more than just a fortress. It was the heart of a strictly organized network which in the following decades extended over large parts of the Iranian highlands and as far as Syria. In a time in which political instability, religious tensions, and military violence shaped daily life, Alamut offered the Nizari community protection, orientation, and a firm ideological foundation. It was the visible sign of a movement that did not define itself through territory, but through conviction, discipline, and spiritual strength. The location of Alamut was ideally chosen. High up in the Elburz Mountains, situated on a narrow rocky ridge, the fortress was difficult to access and easy to defend. Whoever approached it had to overcome steep paths and was exposed to the defenders, who could oversee the entire valley. This made Alamut not only a militarily secure place of retreat, but also an ideal place of isolation, a secluded environment that was excellently suited for training and spiritual education. At a time in which the movement was still on the defensive and its existence constantly threatened, Alamut offered the necessary calm and security in order to develop long-term strategies. Inside the fortress, under the leadership of Hassan-i Sabbah, a remarkable structure developed. Alamut became a kind of monastic castle in which an elite of students, fighters, and scholars lived and were trained. This community was not large, but highly organized. The members, above all the so-called fida, devotees, who later became known for targeted assassinations, underwent a strict spiritual and physical training. They studied Ismaili theology, philosophy, logic, and languages, learned to move inconspicuously, to gather information, and in critical moments to act quickly and precisely. Their loyalty was directed to the invisible Imam and their visible leader, Hassan. Alamut was thereby not only a training center and military headquarters, but also a place of intellectual engagement. In the fortress, there was a library, in which theological and philosophical writings were collected, copied, and commented upon. At a time in which access to knowledge was often restricted by political or religious barriers, the community of Alamut contributed to the preservation and transmission of texts and ideas that elsewhere were considered heretical. The combination of spiritual training, practical schooling, and strategic planning made Alamut into a unique center of power, not by size but by depth. At the same time, the fortress had enormous symbolic significance. For the followers of the Nizaris, Alamut became a place of spiritual clarity, of refuge, and of divine order in a world full of chaos. For their enemies, especially the Sunni ruling houses, it was a thorn in the flesh, a symbol of revolt and of defiance. The sheer fact that a relatively small group could hold its ground for decades against superior military forces made Alamut into a myth, both within the movement and beyond. The fortress was over the years not only defended, but supported through a network of further castles and outposts which were built or taken over in remote mountain regions. This network, in connection with an effective system of communication through couriers and secret signs, made it possible for the Nizaris to spread information quickly and to react flexibly to threats. Alamut was thereby not only the ideological headquarters, but the control center of an early medieval intelligence service, efficient, discreet, and deadly precise. Alamut became the epitome of a movement that distinguished itself not by numerical strength or military size, but by strategic thinking, organizational discipline, and spiritual cohesion. For the Nizaris, it was a holy city, a bulwark of truth, and a sign of divine guidance. For their enemies, it was a nightmare, hard to grasp, even harder to destroy. That Alamut finally fell only in 1256 through the massive force of the Mongol invasion underlines its resilience. Yet by that time, its reputation had long since spread beyond the mountains into the world as the legendary center of the assassins. Goal, mission, and protection of the faith community. The central goal of the Nizaris, as the community around Hassan-i Sabbah and his successors called themselves, was never the construction of a great empire or the conquest of wide territories. Their concern was primarily the protection and preservation of their own faith community. In a time of massive religious tensions in which the Shiite minorities were suppressed and persecuted by the Sunni majority, mere survival was already an act of resistance. The Nizaris regarded themselves as bearers of a divinely legitimized truth embodied by the hidden imam, and saw themselves as his faithful servants in a hostile world. Their mission was religiously and ideologically motivated, to preserve the light of their doctrine, to spread it, and at the same time to fight those who sought to extinguish it. The external pressure was enormous. The Sunni Seljuks, who controlled large parts of Persia, considered the Nizaris dangerous heretics. For them, the doctrine of the Nizaris was not only theologically deviant, but politically subversive. The claim that only the rightful imam possessed the knowledge to interpret divine truth represented a direct challenge to the religious authority of the Sunni ulama. Likewise, the political elites saw in the independence of the Nizaris, particularly in their mountain fortresses such as Alamut, a potential threat to the stability and loyalty within the realm. Not infrequently, they attempted to suppress the movement militarily, by besieging castles, instigating conspiracies, or mobilizing local allies against the Nizaris. Yet the Nizaris did not see their opponents only in the Sunni camp. Also among the Christian Crusader states which had established themselves in the Middle East since the end of the 11th century, the danger was recognized early on that emanated from an independently acting, ideologically closed, and politically unpredictable movement. Although over time there were also tactical alliances between Nizaris and individual Christian rulers, especially when common enemies were involved, the relationship remained overall shaped by mistrust and occasional acts of violence. In both cases, towards Sunni as well as Christian opponents, the Nizaris acted not out of lust for expansion, but from a strategic defensive posture. The protection of their own community had the highest priority. The manner in which this protection was carried out was unprecedented in their time. Instead of open field battles, which they could hardly have won due to lack of resources, the Nizaris relied on a sophisticated mixture of diplomacy, disguise, psychological warfare, and targeted interventions. This strategy was based on the thought that the threat from enemies is not eliminated by defeating armies, but by selectively eliminating the decision-makers who gave the orders for attacks. In a world in which political power was often bound to individuals, this approach proved astonishingly effective. The Nizaris did not understand themselves as ordinary fighters. Their mission had a spiritual dimension. Whoever died for the community was regarded as a martyr in the service of the hidden imam. At the same time, the protection of the believers was a religious command. The existence of the movement could only be secured if one actively opposed the enemies, but in a way that was feasible with the available means. The targeted killing of selected opponents was therefore not an expression of brutality or fanaticism, but a deliberate, methodically prepared, and ideologically justified measure of self-defense. Internally, the mission of the Nizaris was likewise clearly outlined: to preserve the faith, to promote education, to strengthen the community, and to guarantee spiritual leadership. The community was tightly structured, spiritually disciplined, and permeated with the thought that their actions, whether peaceful or combative, stood in the service of a higher truth. Their loyalty toward the imam was unshakable, their organization almost monastic, their conviction deeply rooted. Thus, the Nizaris understood their struggle not as an earthly struggle for power, but as part of a divine plan. They stood between the fronts, fought by the majority, isolated in their faith, and yet able for decades to exist, to hold their ground, and to leave in history a legacy that fascinates to this day. Their goal was not domination over others, but the protection of their own, and that makes them one of the most extraordinary communities of their time. Introduction of targeted killing. The introduction of targeted killing as a political instrument was one of the most distinctive characteristics of the Nizaris and contributed decisively to their lasting reputation. While many contemporary movements relied on military conquest and territorial expansion, the Assassins, as they were later called in the West, went a radically different way. They refrained from large-scale wars and preferred precise, symbolically charged interventions in the political power structure by deliberately eliminating individual high-ranking opponents. This strategy was not only a means of self-protection, but also an expression of strategic intelligence in a world in which power often lay in the hands of a few. The executors of these assassinations were the so-called fida, a term derived from the Arabic fida, which means approximately the one who sacrifices himself. The fidas were not merely assassins in the modern sense, but members of an inner elite who with absolute devotion dedicated themselves to their task. Their training was comprehensive. They received instruction in theology, languages, disguise, self-discipline, and movement strategies. Beyond that, they were prepared to completely integrate themselves into the environment of their target person, whether as servant, merchant, guard, or petitioner, in order to be able to strike at the decisive moment. This form of political assassination was, for the time, a revolution. In an era in which political conflicts mostly discharged themselves in bloody battles with numerous civilian victims, the Nizaris aimed at the exact opposite: minimal violence with maximum effect. A single fida, who succeeded in killing a powerful governor, general, or religious leader, could destabilize an entire power structure. The message was always the same. No one, even at the top of the hierarchy, was invulnerable as long as he openly opposed the Nizaris. This psychological effect was of inestimable value. It caused many rulers to think twice before taking action against the community. The choice of means was as calculated as it was symbolic. The fidas almost always used daggers, never poison or ranged weapons. This had several reasons. On the one hand, it was proof of courage and determination. On the other hand, it prevented doubts about authorship. The act was public, often in open squares, at ceremonies, or even in religious buildings. The assassin usually let himself be arrested or was killed on the spot. He did not flee, but completed his deed with the certainty that his victim would unfold a significant effect. In the logic of the movement, the death of the individual was not a loss, but an investment in the survival of the community. These assassinations also served communication. They replaced official proclamations or military demonstrations. When an opponent of the Nizaris fell, this was always also a signal to others, a form of strategic warning, an act of political rhetoric through action. Targeted killing thus became a central component of the foreign policy of the movement, precise, calculated, intimidating, and efficient. It was a method to achieve with very limited resources an oversized effect. At the same time, this procedure was an expression of the realistic self-assessment of the movement. The Nizaris were aware that they were numerically inferior, militarily had no chance against superior enemies, and stood ideologically isolated. The targeted killing of individual decision-makers was for them not only an act of resistance, but a necessity in order to secure the survival of the community. They were permanently in a state of emergency and reacted with a strategically thought-out, morally, from their perspective, legitimate means. Over the centuries, this practice was by many observers, especially in the West, misunderstood as proof of fanaticism or blind obedience. In fact, however, it was the expression of a deliberate strategy which rested on discipline, planning, and absolute conviction. The fidas were not will-less tools, but part of a community whose entire thought and action was directed toward being able to hold its ground in a hostile world. Targeted killing was their most dangerous and at the same time most effective tool. Etymology of the term assassins. The origin of the term assassins is closely connected with the perception and the political propaganda of their enemies, and at the same time gives insight into the cultural misunderstandings between the Islamic world and Christian Western historiography. The term common today in Western usage for the Nizari Ismailis, that Shiite movement which in the Middle Ages became known for its targeted political assassinations, goes most probably back to the Arabic word Hashishian. This designation, however, was not a self-name, but was given to the Nizaris by their opponents, derogatory, polemical, and probably deliberately defamatory. The Arabic word Hashishiyin is presumably derived from the term hashish. The frequent assumption is that the members of the movement, in particular the Fidas, those assassins who with utmost determination killed high-ranking enemies, had been drugged before their missions in order to secure their obedience or to put them into a kind of trance state. This interpretation, however, is historically extremely questionable and is largely rejected by modern scholarship. Much more, the term is an early form of political defamation used by Sunni opponents, especially the Seljuks, to portray the Nizaris as irrational, dangerous, and morally degenerate. The foreign designation Hashishiyin served the purpose of dehumanization. By associating them with drug use, not only was their religious claim to truth ridiculed, but also their method, particularly the targeted killing of high-ranking figures, was devalued as the work of mindless fanatics. This portrayal was later adopted by European Crusaders, who on their journey through the Near East came into contact with the Nizaris, or at least heard of them. For many, the idea of a sect that controlled assassins with intoxicants and sent them blindly into death was equally fascinating and terrifying. Thus, the term assassins entered the European languages via Latin and Old French sources, and there became a collective term for mysterious murderers. In the West, this name quickly became enshrouded with legends. Writers, chroniclers, and later also travelers such as Marco Polo contributed to solidifying the image of the hashish eaters. Especially Marco Polo in the 13th century described in his travel report, presumably on the basis of hearsay and exaggerations, a story in which young men were allegedly drugged with hashish and brought into a splendid garden in order to suggest to them paradise. After awakening, they were told that they would return there if they committed a murder for their lord. This story is hardly historically verifiable, but it shaped the European notion of the assassins for centuries as fanatical killers, controlled by intoxication and religious promises. In reality, there are no reliable contemporary sources that prove that the Nizaris systematically used hashish, neither in daily life nor in their training. Much even speaks against it. The strict discipline, the ascetic way of life in Alamut, and the high moral standards within the movement make such a practice appear incompatible with their own order. The rumor of hashish consumption was presumably a tactically employed means to undermine the legitimacy of the Nizaris and to make them appear in the eyes of the public as deviant, insane, or un-Islamic. The fact that from this polemical foreign designation there became a fixed term in many European languages, such as assassin in English or assassino in Italian, is a remarkable example of how deeply political propaganda can penetrate into linguistic usage. The word assassin today in almost all Western cultures stands for the assassin as such, detached from its historical origin. And yet behind the term lies a real movement whose history is far more complex, differentiated, and significant than the simple image of the drug-intoxicated murderer could ever convey. Thus, the etymology of the term is a mirror of the centuries-long tension between external perception and self-conception, between the creation of myth and historical reality. The Nizaris themselves never called themselves assassins, yet this name, originating as an insult, became the symbol of one of the most mysterious and at the same time strategically most intelligent movements of the Middle Ages. No mass killings. In contrast to many other political or religious movements of the Middle Ages, the Nizaris, who became known under the name assassins, were characterized by a remarkable form of the use of violence. Their acts of killing were not indiscriminate, brutal, or mass scale, but of carefully chosen precision. In a time in which wars were often conducted with enormous cruelty against entire population groups, the Nizaris pursued a different, controlled approach. Their assassinations were not directed against uninvolved persons, but exclusively against specific individuals who had been identified as a direct threat to the community. In this deliberate limitation of violence lay both an ideological and tactical decision, and a crucial reason why their actions did not end in anarchic chaos, but in a strategically controlled form of resistance. The targets were in most cases political, military, or religious leaders, whose actions were directly directed against the interests or survival of the Nizaris. They were not chosen arbitrarily, but identified on the basis of careful information gathering and strategic analysis. They were often governors, viziers, judges, or high clerics, men who, for example, commanded pogroms against the Ismaili population, planned campaigns against Nizari fortresses, or through incitement in sermons influenced the masses. These persons were considered not only political opponents, but also representatives of a hostile ideological system that questioned the very existence of the community. In this regard, each assassination was not only a means of eliminating a danger, but also a symbolic act. The targeted killing of a power holder sent a clear message to the political elite. Whoever acted against the Nizaris was not untouchable. This message had an enormous psychological effect, which went far beyond the actual act of violence. It led many opponents to begin to choose their words and actions more cautiously, out of fear of becoming themselves the target of an assassination. In a certain sense, the Nizaris thereby created an invisible shield of protection around their community, not through military strength, but through the strategic use of fear. Despite this efficiency, it is important to emphasize that the Nizaris never resorted to blind violence. There are no reports of massacres, plundering, or targeted attacks on the civilian population, a fact which clearly distinguishes them from other religious or politically motivated movements of their time. They did not kill out of hatred or for revenge, but only when they believed that thereby a real threat could be eliminated or an important strategic effect achieved. This targeted, controlled application of violence is one of the reasons why, despite their numerical inferiority, they remained capable of survival for so long. In their own ideology, this form of action was clearly anchored. The Nizari saw themselves as guardians of a divine order, not as destroyers of the existing world. Their mission did not consist in sowing chaos, but in protecting their community and preserving the truth of their faith. Violence was not an end in itself, but a tool among many, always bound to clear criteria and moral boundaries that were defined within the movement. This moral self-commitment is remarkable, especially in comparison to the often unrestrained cruelties that were the order of the day in the Middle Ages. Even in contemporary perception, this difference was noticeable. Many opponents of the Nizaris, for example among the Crusaders, indeed reported with horror about their lethality, but not about cruelty against uninvolved persons. The image of the Fida, who killed his target with surgical precision and then surrendered himself to death, was terrifying, but it was also marked by a strange form of respect. The assassins were uncanny, yes, but not barbaric. Thus, the killings of the Nizaris must be evaluated in their historical context, much more differentiated than the simplifying cliché of the fanatical murderer suggests. They followed a rational, purposeful strategy, and despite all radicalism, remained always limited in their extent. History knows hardly another example of a movement that achieved its political effectiveness with such controlled violence, without ever falling into the temptation of mass destruction or blind terrorism. In their precision lay not only their strength, but also a part of their moral demarcation from the enemies against whom they fought. Famous victims. The most famous victim was Nizam al-Mulk, the long-serving Grand Vizier of the Seljuks, who in 1092 was killed by a Fida under still unclear circumstances. Nizam al-Mulk was not only a political strategist of outstanding influence, but also a declared opponent of the Ismailis. As the highest administrator of the Seljuk Empire, He had in the previous decades built up a strong Sunni state system and had decisively promoted the founding of madrasas, theological colleges for the dissemination of Sunni orthodoxy. He was a symbol of the religious and political order against which the Nizaris positioned themselves. His assassination was therefore not only a loss for the Seljuk system of rule, but a direct attack on the ideological front line between Sunnism and Ismaili doctrine. The circumstances of the attack were typical for that time. The assassin approached Nizam al-Mulk in disguise, possibly as a dervish or petitioner, and used a public moment to carry out the attack. The perpetrator, as in many comparable cases, was killed on the spot. The act deeply shook the Seljuk establishment. Nizam al-Mulk was not only a key figure of administration, but through his intellectual authority, also an ideological adversary of the Nizaris. His death showed that even the most powerful personalities were not untouchable, a lesson whose effect went far beyond the immediate political damage. Yet, Nizam al-Mulk was not the only target. Over the course of the decades, numerous other high-ranking personalities fell victim to the fidas. Among them were governors, military commanders, judges, religious leaders, and even members of the Crusader states. The assassinations always followed a clear pattern: careful preparation, disguise of the assassin, execution in a symbolic setting, and subsequent death of the perpetrator. The selection of the victims was never random. They were always persons whose actions were directly directed against the Nizaris or posed an immediate threat to their autonomy. Another remarkable example was the murder of one of the emirs of Aleppo, who openly opposed the Nizari presence in Syria. This assassination also had far-reaching consequences, for it led to princes in the region adopting a more cautious attitude toward the assassins. In some cases, the movement even succeeded in forcing political concessions by deliberately exerting pressure on local rulers, not through armies, but through the constant knowledge that a single man could suffice to upset the balance. These assassinations contributed significantly to the reputation of the Nizaris. For their enemies, they were a constant factor of insecurity. For neutral observers, a fascinating phenomenon of discipline and purposefulness, and for their followers, proof of the divinely inspired efficiency of the movement. The fact that the assassinations were carried out publicly and without regard for the assassin's own survival gave them the character of a political demonstration, a demonstration of determination, power, and religious willingness to sacrifice. The famous victims of the Nizaris thus testify not only to the military reach of the movement, but above all to their ability to enforce their interests with minimal means. In a time in which political power was closely tied to individuals, the death of a key actor often meant a lasting shift in the balance of power. Exactly this the Nizaris knew how to use, with deadly precision: expansion into Syria. The expansion of the Nizaris into Syria represented a decisive step in the development of the movement, for it meant not only a geographical widening, but also a stronger involvement in the power conflicts of the eastern Mediterranean. While the main fortress of Alamut continued to remain the ideological and organizational center of the Nizaris in Persia, in Syria, under the leadership of Rashid ad-Din Sinan, there arose a new independent power center with the castle of Masyaf as its core. Here, in the mountainous hinterland between Homs and Tripoli, the Syrian Nizaris established themselves as an important political actor in the midst of the fragmented and often mutually rival principalities of the Crusaders, the Sunni dynasties, and local lords. Rashid ad-Din Sinan, one of the most dazzling figures of Nizari history, took over in the 12th century the leadership of the Syrian Assassins and developed into an almost mythical figure. In Western tradition, he entered history as the Old Man of the Mountain, a title which symbolized less his actual age than rather his authority, seclusion, and inscrutability. Under his leadership, Masyaf became not only a strategic fortress, but also the spiritual center of the Nizari movement in the Levant. The castle itself was significantly smaller than Alamut, but its position on a steep rocky plateau made it nearly impregnable and into an ideal place of retreat for planning, training, and defense. The Syrian expansion of the Nizaris was a reaction to the political circumstances of the time. The Syrian heartland in the 12th century was a patchwork of rival powers. Fatimids, Seljuks, Ayyubids, and Crusader states sought to establish themselves in the region. In this unstable environment, the Nizaris found space to build up their own power base, often less through open violence than through skillful alliances, targeted assassinations, and diplomatic balancing acts. Mashaf was thereby not only militarily secured, but embedded in a network of further small fortresses, which lay along strategic routes and served as observation posts, training centers, or places of retreat. Sinan understood masterfully how to use the geopolitical situation. He played rival forces against one another, concluded temporary alliances, even with Christian princes, when it served the safeguarding of Nizari interests. At the same time, he always remained independent, a ruler without a large land, but with influence that reached far beyond the walls of Masyaf. His authority was based not only on military control, but also on his role as spiritual leader and representative of the hidden imam. For the Nizari believers in Syria, Sinan was more than a commander. He was a kind of living mediator to the truth, who watched over the fate of the community. Under his leadership, there were also several spectacular assassinations or assassination attempts on important figures of the region. At the same time, numerous legends spread about his person. For example, that he supposedly possessed a hidden paradise in which he put his followers into a trance, or that his enemies were forced into cooperation merely by the threat of an attack. Although many of these stories were exaggerated or invented by later Western reports, such as those by Marco Polo, they nevertheless show the psychological effect that Sinan and his organization exercised in that period. The Syrian Nizaris under Sinan remained always independent of Alamut, though in ideological agreement. This decentralization of the movement proved to be extremely effective. While in Persia, the political situation was increasingly shaped by the Seljuks and later the Mongols, Syria remained a relatively open space in which the assassins could maintain their role as an unpredictable factor of power. Even great leaders like Saladin had to deal with them, partly through violence, partly through negotiations. The establishment of Masyaf as the center of the Syrian Nizaris under Rashid ad-Din Sinan was thus not only a chapter in the expansion of the movement, but a milestone in its political maturity. From a persecuted sect, there arose an actor on the international stage of the Middle Ages, mysterious, fearsome, yet unmistakably present. Masyaf stood symbolically for what distinguished the Nizaris: independence, strategic cleverness, ideological clarity, and an ability to hold their own even in the midst of the greatest political turmoil. Time of the Crusades. During the time of the Crusades, the Nizaris, known in the West as the Assassins, appeared as equally unpredictable and tactically refined actors, bound not to confessional loyalties, but exclusively to their own strategic interests. This phase of their history reveals particularly clearly the political calculation and flexible alliance policy that shaped the actions of the movement. For while many of their contemporaries acted along confessional lines, Muslims against Christians, Sunnis against Shiites, the Nizaris oriented themselves primarily by the question of who represented a threat to their community, or who could serve as a temporary partner for the enforcement of their own interests. In the complex, fragmented world of the Levant of the 12th and 13th centuries, this behavior was not only unusual, but also highly effective. With the arrival of the Crusaders in the Near East beginning in 1096, the balance of power in the region fundamentally changed. New Christian states such as the Kingdom of Jerusalem, the County of Tripoli, or the Principality of Antioch established themselves along the Mediterranean coast, while Muslim ruling houses such as the Seljuks and later the Ayyubids attempted to defend or reconquer their territories. Amid this geopolitical chaos, small but extremely stable spheres of rule of the Nizaris arose, especially in Syria, where under Rashid ad-Din Sinan, the fortress of Masyaf became the regional center. From here, the assassins acted as an independent power, which shaped its relations with all sides, Muslim as well as Christian, according to the situation. The assassinations of the Nizaris during the time of the Crusades were accordingly not directed one-sidedly against Christian conquerors or Muslim rulers, but against all who concretely threatened their position or behaved openly hostile. Thus, there are recorded cases in which high-ranking Christian leaders became the target of an assassination. Bohemond II of Antioch or Raymond II of Tripoli, princes who had become hostile to the Nizaris or whose expansion came dangerously close to them. Conversely, however, Muslim figures were also among the victims, such as rival emirs, local governors, or religious leaders who in their sermons openly agitated against the Ismailis. This two-track policy caused confusion among contemporaries, and not seldom led to exaggerated legends and speculations about secret alliances or unholy agreements. In fact, the Nizaris occasionally even worked together with Crusaders, or at least existed in quiet coexistence with them. In some cases, protective agreements were even concluded in order to secure trade routes or to eliminate common enemies. Such pragmatic alliances, however, were always temporary and purpose-bound. As soon as the political situation changed, the relationships changed as well. The Nizaris never sought ideological rapprochement to Christianity, but the safeguarding of their political independence in an environment of permanent threat. This flexibility ensured a certain unpredictability, which gave the Nizaris a decisive advantage. Their opponents never knew exactly when and where they would strike, and above all, against whom. They were not part of the great political blocs, but a third independent factor of power. Their willingness to operate beyond religious camps made them, for many, at the same time, dangerous and fascinating. For the Crusaders, who often viewed the religious landscape of the Near East in strongly simplified terms, this was hardly comprehensible. The assassins fit into no scheme. They were Muslims, but not Sunnis. They fought Christians, but not always. They killed, but targeted, not in masses. The time of the Crusades was therefore not only a phase of external threat for the Nizaris, but also an opportunity to refine their diplomatic and strategic skills. By working with shifting alliances, they created political room for maneuver where for other groups only confrontation seemed possible. Their actions during this time were less the expression of an ideological struggle than rather of a deeply thought-out mechanism of self-protection. Thus, in the time of the Crusades, the Nizaris showed a remarkable degree of political adaptability, which distinguished them from almost all other actors of their time. They were not only survivors, but shapers in a complex political system and used their limited means with maximum effect. In a world in which people often reacted with brutal violence, they relied on strategy, timing, and precision, with the firm intention of being able to hold their ground even against powerful enemies. Attempted assassination of Saladin. In the years 1175 and 1176, there occurred two spectacular attempted assassinations which targeted the perhaps most famous Muslim ruler of the Crusader period, Saladin, the founder of the Ayyubid dynasty and later conqueror of Jerusalem. These attempted attacks did not come from Crusaders, but from the Nizaris, those mysterious, disciplined-acting assassins who, under Rashid ad-Din Sinan, from their fortress of Masyaf, observed the political events of the region and intervened selectively. That even such a powerful and popular figure as Saladin was not safe from an attack by the Nizaris demonstrates impressively the influence and reach that this movement had achieved in the 12th century. The tensions between the Nizaris and Saladin were not ideological, but political in nature. Saladin had at first distinguished himself through his military successes as a general under the Zengid ruler Nur ad-Din, and after his death rose quickly to become the dominant power in Syria and Egypt. In doing so, he pursued the goal of uniting the Muslim world against the Crusaders, which in practice meant bringing smaller independent dominions, including the Nizari sphere of influence, under his control or at least neutralizing them. His aggressive expansion northward and his claim to religious authority were perceived by the Nizaris as a threat, especially because they feared being suppressed or exterminated under his Sunni-oriented order. The first assassination attempt took place in 1175. The sources differ in details, but the core of the reports is consistent. A group of Fidas penetrated into the vicinity of Saladin, probably during a campaign or in one of his camps, but could not kill him. At least one of the attackers was captured, and it is reported that under torture he remained silent, emphasized his loyalty, and showed no remorse until the end. Already this first event impressed contemporaries. The thought that a small, distant community was capable of seriously endangering the life of one of the most powerful rulers of the Near East was profoundly disturbing and at the same time commanded respect. A year later, in 1176, followed a second attempt, this time apparently even better planned. Saladin was in northern Syria during a campaign when once again several fighters gained access to his camp, possibly disguised as bodyguards or servants. The attack occurred suddenly and with brutal determination. Saladin was wounded, but survived. His bodyguard reacted quickly and killed the attackers. The incident spread rapidly throughout the region and once again raised the question of how so few persons had managed to come into the immediate vicinity of one of the best protected men of their time. Saladin reacted to these attacks with the utmost seriousness. He ordered extensive security measures, increased his personal guard, and as a consequence undertook a military expedition against the fortress of Masyaf. The siege, however, remained unsuccessful, either because of the inaccessible terrain or, as some chroniclers report, because there was a secret understanding between him and Rashid ad-Din Sinan. Allegedly, there was a negotiation after which Saladin assured that he would henceforth leave the Nizaris in peace in return for a cessation of the assassinations. Whether this is historically certain remains unclear, but the fact that Saladin later made no further attempts to destroy the power center of the assassins suggests a kind of tacit agreement. The assassination attempts against Saladin showed two things very clearly. On the one hand, the determination of the Nizaris not to spare even the most powerful opponents. On the other hand, their political flexibility. That despite these attacks, there was no open war speaks for the ability of both sides to deal pragmatically with their conflicts. For the Nizaris, the attempt to kill Saladin was not an expression of fanatical frenzy, but a strategic means to defend themselves against a growing power factor that threatened to marginalize them. Reputation as a fearsome sect. The image that formed in Europe of the assassins was less the result of sober observation than rather a projection of fears, astonishment, and cultural incomprehension. The Crusaders who came into the Near East in the 12th and 13th centuries, there encountered many religious and political groups unfamiliar to them. Yet hardly any was so inscrutable and at the same time so fascinating as the Nizaris. Their targeted assassinations, their isolated mountain fortresses, their secrecy, and their willingness to sacrifice their own lives for a higher goal. All this etched itself deeply into the memory of those who from the Christian West had entered into a completely differently structured world. There arose a reputation that soon took on a life of its own and made the assassins into a legend, as mystical, fanatical murderers, as shadow beings who struck from concealment. The Crusaders came from a society in which wars were conducted through armies, open battles, and sieges. The notion that a small conspiratorial community deliberately killed individual political personalities and in doing so sought neither booty nor glory was to them both alien and frightening at the same time. The Nizaris did not fit into any known enemy image. They were Muslims, but not Sunnis, not Turks, not Arabs, and they fought both Christians and other Muslims. This unclassifiability, combined with their efficiency, lent them an almost supernatural aura. In the reports that later reached Europe, the assassins were not understood as a political movement, but as a sect, secret, fanatical, and guided by dark powers. The central figure of this myth became the so-called Old Man of the Mountain, a title that originally referred to Rashid ad-Din Sinan, the leader of the Syrian Nizaris in Masyaf. In the European chronicles, this soon became an almost demonic character, a secret master who lived in an impregnable fortress, commanded his assassins like a magician, and shaped them into will-less tools through drugs and indoctrination. That this image was so enduring lay also in the fact that it confirmed the European spirit of the age. The idea that far in the East there was a secret murderous sect that threatened even kings and commanders could be perfectly integrated into the worldview that the Crusaders already had of their Muslim opponents. The assassins became the epitome of what was perceived as exotically threatening, and their actual actions, their complex ideology, and their political logic disappeared behind a veil of half-knowledge, fables, and deliberate distortion. In this European perception, the assassins ultimately became something they themselves never wanted to be, a mere symbol. Their real history, their inner cohesion, their theological foundations, all this was displaced in favor of a notion that continues to resonate today in literature, film, and video games. The original strategy of the Nizaris to gain political control through targeted violence was in Western reception elevated into a mysterious cult in which blind obedience, drugs, and religious fanaticism formed a dangerous mixture. And yet, in this exaggeration, there also lies an echo of the real power of effect that the Nizaris once had. Their ability, through a few well-planned deeds, to influence the political balance of entire regions was so extraordinary that from it there developed a reputation which, even centuries later, still endured, showing how deeply the fear of the invisible, the uncontrollable, and the ideologically inexplicable sat, and how willingly people clothed this fear in legends. The assassins became in Europe more than a movement, they became a myth, Marco Polo and the legend. In the 13th century, at a time when the Nizaris in reality had already been almost annihilated in Persia by the Mongols and in Syria by the Mamluks, their reputation in the West began to solidify in a new way. No longer through direct encounter or political effect, but through the power of storytelling. One of the most influential legends, which was to shape the image of the assassins into the present, comes from the travel account of the Venetian merchant Marco Polo. In his famous work Il Milione, which describes his alleged experiences on the journey through Asia, there is found a particularly striking passage about the old man of the mountain and his garden of delights. This tale became the foundation of many later myths, although it is highly likely based on exaggeration, hearsay, or complete invention. Marco Polo reports there of a secluded valley shielded by high walls, which had been transformed into a magnificent, artificially created garden, a worldly image of paradise. There, he says, the leader of the assassins had young men drugged, presumably with hashish, in order to bring them asleep into this garden. When they awoke there, surrounded by flowing water, precious fruits, splendid buildings, and beautiful women, they believed they had entered paradise. After a certain time they were again drugged and taken out of the garden, and subsequently kept in the belief that they could only return there if they obeyed the old man of the mountain absolutely and carried out his orders, above all, assassinations. This story had on the medieval European audience an effect both shocking and fascinating. It served several cultural notions at once, that of the dangerous Orient, of religious fanaticism, of secret sects, and of the manipulation of human will. For readers and listeners in the West, the tale became the seemingly rational explanation of how men could voluntarily sacrifice their lives for such a mysterious cause. In truth, however, it is extremely unlikely that Marco Polo knew this story from his own experience, for at the time of his journey, the Nizari center in Alamut had already been destroyed. More likely is that he reproduced a version of rumors that had already circulated in Persia and beyond for generations, rumors spread by the enemies of the Nizaris in order to devalue their discipline and their courage as the product of deception or drug use. Modern historians therefore view Marco Polo's report of the Paradise Garden with great skepticism. It cannot be ruled out that within the Ismaili community there were symbolic or didactic rituals that worked with concepts of the afterlife. But such fantasies of drugged young men who were brainwashed through sensory stimuli are entirely lacking in historical foundation. The Fidas of the Nizaris, by all that is known, were deeply schooled in theology, ideologically convinced, and strategically trained. Their willingness to sacrifice was not the result of manipulation, but the expression of an inner conviction formed over years. The idea that they had been driven to action through an artificial garden and hashish fails to recognize the intellectual depth and self-discipline that characterized the movement. Nevertheless, Marco Polo's account became extremely influential. In Europe, it consolidated the image of the assassins as archaic tools of deception controlled by a mysterious ruler. The Paradise Garden became the metaphor for the power of religious delusion and spiritual enslavement in an age that primarily associated such notions with Islam. The Western understanding of the assassins thereby shifted definitively, from a real political movement to a morally charged myth. The story of the Paradise Garden continues to have effect to this day. It can be found in literature, film, and especially in modern adaptations such as the Assassin's Creed series, often without critical distance to the source. Yet it is less a window into the past than a mirror of the fears and fantasies of medieval Europe. What Marco Polo told was not only a travel report, it was a powerful narrative about power, control, and otherness, and in it, reality and fiction merged into an image that still hovers over the assassins, a myth born from distance, misunderstanding, and literary fascination. End of the Persian Assassins. The end of the Persian Assassins in the year 1256 marked a dramatic turning point in the history of the Nizaris, and at the same time, the abrupt end of a political and ideological power center that for over a century and a half had, with minimal resources and maximal effect, influenced events in the Near East. Their downfall came not gradually or through inner decay, but with brutal violence and from outside, through the arrival of the Mongols under the leadership of Hulagu Khan, a grandson of Genghis Khan, who, on the orders of his brother Munka Khan, set out to subjugate the Islamic Near East. In his campaign against the Muslim realms, the fortresses of the Nizaris also came into his sights, not because of ideological opposition, but because they were considered potential disruptive factors, and their strategic location in the mountains of Persia could become dangerous for the Mongol troops. The Mongols, notorious for their ruthless conduct of war, had at that time already brought large parts of Central Asia and northern China under their control. Their strategy was marked by logistical superiority, technical sophistication, especially in siege warfare, and a consistent destruction of any resistance. They regarded the fortifications of the Nizaris, in particular Alamut, not only as obstacles, but as militarily intolerable centers of unrest that had to be eliminated in order to secure the establishment of Mongol rule in Persia and beyond. The plan was clear: the complete elimination of the organization, the smashing of its infrastructure, and the disempowerment of its spiritual leadership. In the run-up to the attack, diplomatic negotiations began, which, however, from the outset, stood under the pressure of the unavoidable Mongol advance. The then leader of the Persian Nizaris, Rukn ad-Din Kursha, tried to gain time and signaled willingness to submit, but his negotiating strategy was inconsistent and hesitant. The Mongols, who placed no trust in assurances and relied on military superiority, finally began systematic attacks on the Nizari fortresses. The siege of Alamut, the symbolic and operational center of the Persian assassins, represented the decisive blow. Despite its geographical inaccessibility and legendary defensive capacity, the fortress could not withstand the modern siege engines of the Mongols. After months of encirclement and fighting, Alamut fell in December 1256. Contrary to some later depictions, the fortress was not taken in a dramatic last battle, but through a mixture of military pressure and internal surrender. Rukn ad-Din Kursha capitulated. The archives and libraries of Alamut were plundered, many texts burned, a large part of the military and intellectual elite killed or driven out. The destruction of Alamut was not only a military victory, it was a deliberate erasure of an idea. The Mongols, who in many cases practiced religious tolerance, proceeded against the Nizaris with unusual severity. They destroyed not only Alamut, but also other important fortresses in the Elburz Mountains and beyond, such as Gerdku or Lamasar. The systematic annihilation aimed to eradicate the infrastructure of the movement so completely that no revival would be possible. After the fall of Alamut, the Nizari presence in Persia almost entirely disappeared from political events. There were indeed isolated attempts to maintain small communities or hidden networks, but the organizational cohesion, the strategic leadership, and the territorial control were irretrievably lost. The downfall was final, at least in worldly terms. The movement did survive in a spiritual and religious sense, but as a political force with military strength, it was extinguished in Persia. For the history of the assassins, this event meant not only the end of a chapter, but the radical transformation of their self-understanding. The age of fortresses, of fetas, of assassinations and targeted interventions in power was over. What remained was a scattered community, which in the following centuries preserved its identity more on religious and spiritual levels, up to the present-day Ismaili community. End of the Syrian Assassins. After the fall of Alamut in Persia, one branch of the Nizaris still remained active in the political game of the region, the Syrian Assassins, with their center in the mountain fortress of Masyaf. But this last bastion, too, was not to endure permanently. In the year 1273, Masyaf was conquered by the Mamluks, with which the military and political end of the Nizari movement in the Near East was definitively sealed. The smashing of this center marked the end for an organization that for almost 2 centuries had played as a small but extremely effective actor in the power conflicts between Crusaders, Muslim dynasties, and regional princes. The downfall of the Syrian Assassins, however, did not occur in a single dramatic battle, but in the context of a changing political environment that left ever less space for small, autonomous centers of power. After the death of Rashid ad-Din Sinan in 1193, the legendary Old Man of the Mountain who had led the movement in Syria to its greatest flourishing, the organization increasingly lost strategic skill and ideological radiance. None of his successors succeeded in exercising the same authority or in maintaining the fragile balance between the Christian and Muslim powers. Without a central charismatic leadership and under growing pressure from expansive states, the Syrian Nizari infrastructure began to crumble. The decisive threat from the middle of the 13th century no longer came from the Crusaders, but from the Mamluks, a military elite corps that had risen to power in Egypt and set out to unite the entire Near East under Sunni Islamic control. Under Sultan Baybars, the Mamluks pursued a systematic policy of centralization, military consolidation, and religious unification. They saw in the assassins not only a security risk, but also a heretical movement that resisted the religious order. The Mamluks were determined to tolerate no autonomous enclaves within their realm, especially not such as were marked by their own ideology, their own military tradition, and a network of secret alliances. In the year 1270, the Mamluks began targeted preparations for the elimination of the Syrian Nizaris. Within a few years, their most important fortresses were isolated and systematically besieged. Finally, Masyaf, too, the symbolic heart of the movement in the Levant, fell. The siege was militarily well prepared, and the Nizaris, facing the Mongol destruction of their Persian branch and the loss of many allies, were no longer in a position to offer effective resistance. Their numbers had shrunk, their resources were limited, their political options exhausted. The fortress was taken, many leaders executed, and the network of the Syrian Nizaris smashed. Thus, not only did the physical presence of the Nizaris as a political power in the region come to an end, but also the age of the Fidas, those assassins who for decades had, through precise acts of violence, intervened deeply in the political decisions of their time. It was the end of an era in which a numerically small but strategically highly developed movement with ideological coherence and tactical determination had played a central role on the geopolitical chessboard of the Middle Ages. What remained was a memory and a myth. The military organization of the assassins was annihilated, their fortresses destroyed, their archives plundered or lost. Yet their history continued to have effect. In the reports of Crusaders, in the writings of Islamic chroniclers, in tales, legends, and later in European literature. Even though Masyaf had fallen, the image of the assassins remained alive, as a dark but fascinating marginal figure of history, as a warning example of the power of the hidden, and as a symbol that even small forces can have great effects. With the fall of Masyaf, the chapter of the Nizaris as a military-political actor ended. Yet at the same time, a new chapter began, that of a religious community which henceforth, more quietly but no less persistently, would devote itself to its spiritual continuity. In this transformation, from armed movement to peaceful faith community, lay a change as profound as their violent end. Assassins in tradition, religious survival after the military end of the Nizaris in the 13th century. With the destruction of Alamut by the Mongols and the fall of Masyaf to the Mamluks in the 13th century, one might have assumed that thereby also the ideology and the religious identity of this movement had been extinguished. Yet the opposite occurred. The assassins did indeed disappear as a political power factor from the stage of history, but their spiritual and religious identity endured through the centuries. The Ismaili community, to which the Nizaris belonged, continues to live on to this day, not as a militant movement, but as a peaceful religious community with several million followers worldwide. The central difference between the historical order of assassins and the present-day Ismaili community lies in the relationship to violence. While the Nizaris in the Middle Ages used targeted killings as a means of political resistance, in their view as a necessary defense against hostile oppression, this practice was in the later course of history completely abandoned. After the military collapse, the focus of the Ismaili communities increasingly shifted to the preservation of religious teachings, to education, welfare, and the cultivation of a communal identity. The ideals of reason, of loyalty to the imam, and of spiritual enlightenment moved into the center, not defense by the sword, but resilience through knowledge and faith. The centuries-long persecution by both Sunni authorities and political great powers led to the Ismaili groups increasingly withdrawing into remote or politically stable regions. In doing so, they succeeded in preserving their theological tradition, often orally, sometimes also in secret manuscripts, and in adapting it to new social, cultural, and political environments. Especially in the Iranian highlands, in Syria, in the Indian subcontinent, and in parts of Central Asia, local Ismaili communities developed, which remained connected by a spiritual leader, the imam. This imam, who as a direct descendant of the Prophet Muhammad possessed a divinely legitimized competence of leadership, remained the central element of religious practice. After the destruction of the political structures, however, there followed a significant transformation. The imam was no longer a military commander, but above all, a spiritual teacher. This shift enabled the Ismaili tradition not only to survive, but in some regions even to flourish. Over time, flourishing communities arose with their own culture of education, their own legal tradition, and often high social cohesion. In the 19th and 20th centuries, this development was particularly shaped by the line of the Aga Khans, a succession of imams who, especially under the leadership of Aga Khan II and his successor Aga Khan IV, had great influence on the social organization and self-understanding of the Ismaili community. They introduced far-reaching reforms, strengthened educational institutions, initiated health programs, and promoted the role of women. The Ismaili identity increasingly transformed into an active, modern-oriented faith community, which at the same time preserved its spiritual depth and its historical rootedness. Today, the Ismaili community lives dispersed worldwide, from Canada to East Africa to India and Pakistan. It is widely known for its commitment in the field of education, for its philanthropic projects, and for its emphatic rejection of violence and extremism. The memory of the time of the assassins is by no means denied, but it is understood as a historical chapter, a phase in which radical means seemed necessary in order to secure the survival of a threatened faith community. The present-day Ismaili identity is not based on the continuation of this violence, but on the break with it, as a conscious decision for peace, dialogue, and intellectual development. Thus, the assassin tradition did not survive in the form of assassins or fortresses, but as a spiritual lineage that, over centuries, was able to preserve itself through change, adaptation, and inner renewal. The militant resistance gave way to a spiritual resilience, and from a persecuted sect, there arose a worldwide community with strong social engagement and a deep yet unobtrusive religious identity. What remained was not the dagger, but the consciousness, a reminder that even out of dark times, new forms of faith, community, and hope can arise. Myths and popular culture. The history of the assassins has, over the centuries, occupied not only historians and scholars of religion, but also inspired the imagination of the broader public. From a relatively small, historically clearly definable movement in the medieval Near East, there developed a myth which in modern popular culture has taken on a remarkable life of its own. Today, the assassins are known less from the sources of Islamic history than from novels, films, and especially video games. Above all, through the internationally successful series Assassin's Creed, which since 2007 has reached a worldwide audience and has lastingly shaped the image of the assassins in popular culture. The fascination with the assassins rests on several elements that lend themselves excellently to fictional adaptations: the mysterious appearance, the apparent invisibility in the crowd, the deadly efficiency, the loyalty to a higher order, and the idea of a centuries-old order acting in secret. These features were, over the course of history, ever further embellished through travel reports such as those of Marco Polo, through Orientalist literature of the 19th century, and through fantasy and adventure novels. From a real existing Ismaili splinter group, which deliberately eliminated political opponents, there became a kind of archetypal secret order, a mixture of religious sect, espionage organization, and philosophical knightly order. In Assassin's Creed, this myth reaches a new dimension. The game series takes up historical figures, places, and events, embedding them in a fictional confrontation between two secret groups: the assassins, who fight for freedom and self-determination, and their adversaries, the Templars, who seek to impose control and order. This duality is not historically attested, yet it gives the series a clear moral framework and allows political and social themes such as power, surveillance, resistance, and identity to be clothed in an exciting narrative form. The games lead the players through meticulously recreated cities such as Jerusalem at the time of the Crusades, Renaissance Florence, Revolutionary Paris, or Victorian London, always with the goal of uncovering a hidden truth through stealth, climbing skill, and precise assassinations. What is special about this form of popular culture is that it does not use history merely as a backdrop, but also as a projection surface for modern questions and longings. What does freedom mean in a controlled world? How far may individual resistance go? Can violence be justified if it is directed against an overpowering system? These themes are not new. They were already present in the reality of the historical assassins, but in their aestheticized, interactive form, they reach an entirely new audience. At the same time, this popularization is not without problems. The historical complexity of the Nizaris, their theological depth, their real political strategy, their religious context, is in popular culture often strongly simplified or even completely ignored. The name assassin is in many minds no longer associated with the Ismaili faith or with the medieval Near East, but with hoods, daggers, and acrobatic leaps from church towers. This distortion can lead to the loss or the never arising of a differentiated understanding of the actual history. Nevertheless, it cannot be denied that myth-making is also a form of cultural processing. It preserves memory, even if in altered form, and gives it new meanings. That a small Shiite movement, which arose in the 11th century in the remote mountains of Persia, reappears in the 21st century as a global pop icon is an expression of its lasting fascination. The myth of the assassins lives on not as a continuation of their real history, but as a mirror of what we today make out of history, a mixture of fiction, ideology, and the search for identity. Seen in this way, the assassins today are both a fascinating chapter of Islamic history and a cultural symbol with worldwide reach. Their traces lead not only to the ruins of Alamut, but also onto cinema screens, into bookshelves, and onto television screens in millions of living rooms, and they show how much history lives on, even when it has become legend. Historical re-evaluation. In today's historiography, the traditional portrayal of the assassins is increasingly being critically questioned. What for centuries was considered secure knowledge, the tales of bloodthirsty assassins, drug cults, secret rituals, and absolute obedience to a mystical leader, often turns out, upon closer inspection, to be the product of hostile propaganda, sensationalism, and cultural misunderstanding. Modern historians therefore strive to distinguish between myth and reality, and to place the Nizari movement within its actual historical, theological, and political context. A central point of this reevaluation is the realization that many of the well-known reports about the assassins stem from second- or third-hand sources, authors who had no direct access to the inner structures of the movement or whose hostility toward the Nizaris was obvious. Both Sunni chroniclers and European crusaders often described the assassins as a demonic sect or fanatical murderers. This portrayal fulfilled several functions at once. It explained in a simple way the effectiveness of this small group, discredited their faith, and underscored the threat posed by a seemingly uncontrollable power. That the reports were thereby heavily exaggerated is self-evident. Particularly formative for the European image of the assassins was the story of the hashish eaters, an interpretation that goes back to the term hashishiyin, used in Arabic sources as an insult. This designation was later falsely connected with the assumption that the assassins were intoxicated with drugs and thus made into will-less tools. Modern research, however, has found no credible evidence for the systematic use of intoxicants within the Nizari community. On the contrary, the sources point to a highly disciplined organization whose members were ideologically trained and strategically thinking. The Fidas were not puppets, but deeply convinced adherents of their cause. Also, the famous story of the Paradise Garden, popularized among others by Marco Polo, today is regarded as a literary exaggeration, possibly a mixture of hearsay, deliberate dramatization, and projection of European notions of the Orient. Likewise doubtful is the widespread idea that the assassins killed indiscriminately or cultivated terror as an end in itself. On the contrary, the assassinations of the Nizaris were targeted, rare, and always directed against high-ranking opponents. They served the defense of the faith community, the securing of political power, or the symbolic communication with the outside world. Another important aspect of the reevaluation is the religious dimension of the movement. The assassins were not a murderous secret society, but part of a complex Ismaili theology, deeply rooted in Islamic mysticism and philosophy. The Nizaris placed great value on knowledge, loyalty to the Imam, and an understanding of faith that was not only lived outwardly, but also inwardly. Their military actions did not stand in contradiction to their religious self-understanding, but were part of a broader concept of resistance, enlightenment, and spiritual defense. Today, it is also increasingly recognized that the assassins can be understood as a kind of early form of asymmetric warfare, not unlike what in modern times would be called guerrilla tactics or political resistance. In a time in which they were militarily and numerically far inferior, they developed a strategy that allowed them to exert influence, form alliances, and assert their existence against more powerful opponents. Their actions were not irrational, but an expression of will to survive and political intelligence. This differentiated view of the assassins changes not only the understanding of their role in the Middle Ages, but also the way in which one thinks about concepts such as fanaticism or resistance in a historical context. The Nizaris were neither pure heroes nor mere villains. They were actors in a complex political and religious world in which their means, however controversial they may be, lay within a comprehensible framework. Their myth was often laid over their actual significance, yet their reality is no less fascinating, only more differentiated.